Good evening, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us here today. We apologize for the delay in getting started, but thank you so much for being patient with us as well. Um, First of all, it is with great pleasure that we welcome you all here today to Advocata Institute's very first fireside conversation, Institutions Matter, Driving Forces of Economic Growth, with the World Bank's Global Director for Governance, Arturo Herrera Gutiérrez, and the Chair of the Advocata Institute, Murtaza Jafferjee. This conversation aims to delve into the critical issue of governance and reforms which affect us all, seeking to shed light on the challenges and opportunities in institutional development. To jump right in, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today, Arturo Herrera Gutiérrez, the Global Director for Governance at the World Bank. He is vastly experienced in the area of governance as both a practitioner and an academic. A former Secretary of Finance and Public Credit to the Mexican government, Mr. Herrera was also part of the World Bank from 2010 to 2018, during which he held various positions. He has also taught both monetary and banking and macro and microeconomics at El Colegio de Mexico and New York University, where he has also completed his doctoral studies in economics. Mr. Herrera, I now invite you to join us on stage to provide some insights on governance and reforms.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. Let me see where is that. Okay, that's a presentation. It's an honor to be here with you. As it was mentioned in the introduction, I have a very, I would say, singular experience. I was in the government many years ago, then went to come to work for the World Bank and learn a little bit of more of an experience of what the international institutions were doing. Then went back to my country, and I worked as a deputy finance minister, then a finance minister, and as I mentioned it, I was actually a member of the board of governors of the central bank in Mexico. Then I come back to the World Bank. So I have seen the problems from both sides, on the practical side, on the advising side. And so one thing that is important is I left the World Bank in 2018. I went to work for my government, and I come back to the World Bank in 2022, and there was something different in the language that people were mentioning. I start hearing left and right, institutions matter, governance matter, there's need to strengthen institutions, there needs to build institutions. And as having myself a global responsibility, I heard that in South Asia, in East Asia, and Latin America, in the Middle East, in Sub-Saharan Africa. So it seems that this is a concern that is happening everywhere. And the question is, why is this important? So many years ago, the prevalent view was that development was actually about growth. Development was just about putting the countries in a different path and making sure that they will catch up with advanced world. But over time, there was a growing recognition that institutions matter and that it was important to emphasize how things address issues like corruption, institutional coordination, and government functions like human resource management, public investment, public financial management, and debt management. As it is well known, Douglas North wrote about a Nobel Prize laureate wrote about these issues. Now, institutions go across many different areas of the government. So what I'm gonna do today, I'm gonna focus on the role of institutions on three very specific areas, which are very relevant for many countries, but are also very specifically relevant for Sri Lanka today. So the three areas I want to focus are the institutions for supporting fiscal and debt sustainability, institutions for mitigating the risk of corruption, and institutions for enabling the private sector. And let me tell you why. One of the things I probably don't need to explain it, why institutions for fiscal and sustainability are relevant in Sri Lanka. But let me tell you why we are emphasizing it. And let me make a personal note of this. I began studying economics in the mid-'80s. And when I started studying economics, when I started as a little economist in my life, Mexico had an inflation of 65%, and the exchange rate was 0.7. 11 years later, when the tequila crisis started, Mexico's inflation was still 35%, and the exchange rate was 6.42. So through my whole career as a student in college, master's, at PhD, it seems that Mexico was permanently in a crisis, in a debt crisis, in exchange rate crisis, and in a financial crisis. So actually, there was very little other things that we studied at that time as economists, but actually how to address a crisis. And that was not unique to Mexico. Many countries were during the 80s to debt crisis, and the problem in Mexico in 1995 triggered a series of crises in Latin America. That's what is called the tequila crisis, and then in East Asia there was a similar experience in 1997, triggering another series of debt, exchange rate, and financial crisis. But then we learned how to address them, right? When we think about what happened in these years, and we look to what was happening in the 1980s, 12 countries had domestic debt problems associated with default, and 33 countries with sovereign external debt in default or distress. Then by the almost 20 years later, by the early 2000s, only 4 countries had domestic debt default, and 70 countries were in sovereign debt, external debt. So we thought that we have solved that problem, that it was a matter of the past, and that we could focus on some other things. But over the last few years, there have been a series of events happening that have unfortunately made this issue to come back. First was the Great Recession in 2008-2009, the financial crisis, and then COVID. COVID triggered an increase in the debt of many countries. So this issue has returned. And as of December 2023, 35 countries are included in the debt sustainability framework for low-income countries, which is a mechanism that allows countries to defer defer payment. So the issues related with debt and sustainability and fiscal sustainability are back. If we see this map, you will see the percentage of countries which are indebted. Now, there's something very important. The debt over GDP ratio is just a proxy for the capacity of a government to fulfill their financial liabilities. Institutions and the security and having a proper macro framework are also extremely relevant. So if we look to this table, we will see on the first column a series of countries: Brazil, Indonesia, Japan, then the debt over GDP ratio, and finally the interest rate paid by those countries. So the first thing that it will pop up to you if you look it carefully is the highest indebted country in the world is actually Japan, with a debt of 252%. But it's a country which very strong public finances a macro framework. As a result of that, they only pay less than 1% of as an interest rate. So a country like Japan with 252 debt over GDP ratio, they only pay a little bit around 2% of interest rates in GDP. Now, on the other hand, a country like Brazil, with an 84% debt, much smaller than Japan, but with an interest rate of 11%, they pay probably 4 times as much as Japan in terms of interest rate. So the debt over GDP is important, but the way in which a country runs its finances is relevant to make sure that they are in a sustainable path. And when that happens, the lenders, the bondholders, the banks trust in a country, and as a result of that, they tend to charge lower interest rates. Okay, so let me tell you why is this important. Now, that doesn't mean that debt is necessarily bad, and that doesn't mean that cannot be managed through time. But there has to be some consistency to time about it. So let me try to illustrate this with an example. So the deficit, which is just expenditures minus revenue, that's what any country have in their budget minus what collect. They have actually to finance it. So this is equivalent of the change in debt, which is the debt after a period minus the other one. So now, what does that mean? That part is the part that needs to be financed. But let me give you an example. Let's imagine a country, let's call it country A, and they imagine that they have a debt of 100, right? And let's now also assume that this country is growing at 6% per year. Now, does that mean if this country has a debt over GDP too big that they cannot raise debt? Yes, they still could raise debt. If this country were to increase their debt by 5%, given that that denominator is growing faster, by still having a deficit of about 5%, they would still reduce the debt over GDP or over GDP ratio. So this is a kind of exercise that needs to run to check out what a country needs to do in the following years. So still could increase the debt to 105, and the debt over GDP is going to be smaller. So that, let's assume that this country was over-indebted. So that helps us to try to trace a path. Let's assuming that the proper debt over GDP that this country should have is 50%. So that helps us to trace a path to how to reach that over time in an orderly manner, and in any particular year, that difference is what is going to be done in the level. Now, so the technical issues are relatively easy, but the question is how to guarantee in an operative way that this is happening, how to impose discipline within a Ministry of Finance to make sure that this has happened. And I'm talking for experience, right? So let's try to look to who are the characters in this play. So what is important is first to think about the institutional setup to control debt and to ensure fiscal sustainability. So who are the cast? So in a canonical Ministry of Finance, you will have certain functions separated in either by ministries of departments. There would be typically a deputy finance minister in charge of the macro finance, and very often the debt management department is under him or her. Then there will be a revenue vice minister in charge of setting the policies and making the revenue forecast. And then would be a budget vice minister, which is in charge of actually distributing the money, right? If you think about a Ministry of Finance, usually the budget vice minister is the one who everybody tries to knock on their door to get more money, and the revenue vice minister is the one that people try to avoid because that's the one who is collecting taxes. So there may be some other areas like the treasurer and the fiscal attorney, but let us focus on the first three one. So, and this would give us an idea how to set it up. So, as I said, the budget preparation should start by determining what is the proper debt that a country could take in a responsible manner in 1 year. So who comes with that is typically the chief economists, which do a debt sustainability analysis and determine the size of the deficit that a country could have in any given year. Then the second step is also the chief economist determining what are the macro projections. So they determine how much is this country gonna grow, what's the interest rate, and brings into the framework other relevant variables. For example, what would be the price of oil, the appreciation or not of the national currency between relevant currencies. And very important, this is the first institutional arrangements. They provide this macro framework to the tax policy unit. In order to forecast the revenues, it's important to know how much a country is going to grow, because depending how much it's going to grow, it depends how much revenue taxes are going to be collected in value-added taxes or corporate income taxes. But the interesting this here is that between the step 2 and the step 3, that the tax policy experts are going to forecast not with the numbers they want, but with the numbers that somebody else give it to them. And finally, if you take the debt sustainability deficit implied there, plus the revenues, that means all the sources of income that a country is going to have in a given year. So they give that to the budget office to allocate the resources. But the budget office cannot allocate what they want to spend, but they could allocate what the country has. And there are many other countries in which these things are in the opposite way. They start to thinking how much they think to spend. Then they estimate how much they are going to collect. And the difference is the deficit or the net debt. And if that is not in line with the sustainability path, that country may get themselves into a path of increasing debt. Now, the check and balances, the institutional arrangements to fix this are not only necessary to prepare the budget, but also this is what happened inside the Ministry of Finance, but it also should be the way in which the budget is approved at the Parliament and also the way in which the budget is executed. So let me give you an example. I'm going to go really quickly over that. So the Ministry of Finance or the Prime Minister or the President send the proposed budget to the Congress or the Parliament, and then the first thing that the Congress do is approve the net debt that they was received, and then the taxes, and they approve and vote on that. And it's not until they approve and vote on that that they start discussing the expenditure side. So let me explain you what happens if it's not that this. And this is, for example, what we observe in Colombia. So the government sent up the financial package to the Congress, and the Congress start discussing these two things at the same time. So suddenly a member of the Parliament would say, actually, I need a new school for my town. So I need a budget allocation for that. And they would say, well, there's no money. Well, why don't we raise the expected taxes that are going to be collected? So then a result of these mechanics could be our over forecasting in excess of revenues, which not gonna happen. So this is the way that it has to be done. It's approved first the income side, and it's approved later the budget side, and that avoids getting into some sort of conflict of interest at the Congress level. So the anchor of this process is the debt sustainability exercise that I mentioned first, and then a medium-term framework exercise about what the country is going to be growing, what are the interest rates, etc. So this is a typical, I just borrow it from 2 years ago. This is a typical framework that you will find in Mexico. So the growth that you will have in the upper part are consistent with certain debt panel, right? And let me give you an example. So again, this is what the example I was giving, but the increasing in $5 million, whatever, in terms of debt, doesn't mean that that's the only thing that the country needs to contract. For example, if this country has 20 million in loans due, so the debt is going to be reduced from 100 to 80, and then they still have an authorization to contract 5, so they will need to raise 25 million in the financial markets. So the credibility is very important for a country in order to be able to raise money in the financial markets. Now, it's very important that there's discipline in the process, and let me give you an example of how this process could be broken. So this is a country, I'm going to tell you the name now, in which the revenue is approved, then the budget is approved, and when the revenue is approved, implicitly, the net debt is already approved. But then the Congress said, actually, I'm going to explicitly approve in a second process an authorization to increase and go and contract that debt. And then it creates a problem with what was already approved and what needs to be approved. And that country is not a developing country. That's actually what happened in the US. And that's what you may have seen in the news, when despite the fact that they have a budget approved, there's a negotiation with a Congress that could actually paralyze the government. So in order to guarantee that there's a proper management, we have a tool at the bank, which is called the PIFA, the Public Expenditure and Financial and Accountability Program, in which we identify several institutional mechanisms to control the public's finance. One of them, this one, is the one related to public to manage the debt. Let me show you what are the comparisons across different regions. So the last region is South Asia, the South Asia region, the region to which Sri Lanka belongs. The light color purple or lilac is a debt management variable. So the debt management variable is so important that it's a variable that performs better across all regions. But still, if you compare South Asia, let's say, for example, with ECA region, which is Europe and Central Asia tend to do better than South Asia. So that's about the first set of concerns about what should be built institutional frameworks to guarantee a proper fiscal management. Let me jump now to the second one, which is about corruption. And until a few years ago, even the World Bank thought that corruption was not a development issue. The World Bank thought until the mid-90s that corruption was a political issue, and as such, the World Bank shouldn't be intervening into that. Then in 1996, President Wilkinson at the bank said that corruption was actually a cancer, and it was a development problem. And as such, the World Bank needed to think about it. So there has been many activities to try to actually improve the fight against corruption. So let me show you some graphs. Actually, can you hear me from this mic? Okay. So what you will see here is the countries that have access. Okay. What you have here is the countries that have access to information laws. Basically, in the 1980s, there was no countries with access to information laws. Then, through the last 40 years, there has been an increase on that. I was trying to check just before this talk. When did Sri Lanka actually pass their access to information law? And apparently it's in 2016, right? So around somewhere here is when Sri Lanka introduced their access to information law. So there are advances in the fight against corruption. But then when you look across the globe, and this is one survey which asks firms if they actually pay bribes when someone tries to collect their taxes. In the year 2000, 15% of all the firms report that they were asked to pay bribes. And there's a decrease, but first of all, it's not homogeneous. Sometimes go up, sometimes goes down, and they're still relevant. So there has been some advances in terms of fighting corruption, but this is not homogeneous. And these two graphs actually show that. This is a very interesting because this tells us the number of countries in which corruption has paying tax bribes has decreased. And 64% of countries, there have been improvements. But advances are no homogeneous because in 36% of countries, actually, corruption has been increased. So one of the problems about corruption is that we are not seeing a downward trend across the globe. And if we look to this information, we will see there are seven rule of law factors in the World Justice Projects, and only one of them have improvements, the one on regulations, from 2015 to 22. So there's a mixed results in terms about the fight against corruption, when some indicators tend to improve, but some other indicators tend to decrease. So what we are trying to do now is we are trying to build at the World Bank an integrated approach. That means that there are some areas in which we traditionally have involved, like access to information, transparency, and accountability, but we need to bring and strengthen reforms like procurement, but we need to bring other aspects. And some other aspects are the use of digital technologies to and data analytics to detect corruption, the rule of law, procurement and managed contract, and very important, beneficial ownership transparency. Corruption is becoming much more international. The proceeds of corruption are very frequently shipped to other countries. So the traditional approach needs to add a new approach. That doesn't mean that we are going to disregard this, but we are going to add to these ones this other. So that's a little bit what we are doing in terms of on corruption. But let me now move to the third issue that I was mentioning, which is the institutions that help to strengthening growth, and particularly growth coming from the private sector. So there are several kinds of institutions, public institutions, that impact investment on the private sector. The first one are regulatory agencies. Does the regulatory framework on a country permit a fair competition across the private actors? The second one is public procurement. And public procurement is extremely important. It has a huge part of the budget of a country, but it also, if you take it as a percentage of GDP, public procurement could go anywhere from 3% of GDP to around 14% of GDP. So it's a huge amount of money, and there's a need to make sure that it's done in a proper way. If a company which the owner is friends with a president or a prime minister or a governor or a minister or a secretary get the award because the public procurement is weak, then there's going to be less incentive for firms to actually to invest. Another is the service delivery. I mean, if health and education are relevant, then in the long time there's going to be a workforce with quality. And then judiciary system is very important for many reasons, but including for conflict resolution and tax and customs administration. So what we are seeing in this is what happened in a country. This graph represents the results of a survey which we made to different country firms, in which we asked them what is the most important aspect to take a decision about investment. And the most important aspect is actually the regulatory framework. So what the government do in these activities is very relevant if a country wants to bring investment and actually grow out of it. So let me try to finalize with a few remarks also. Countries used to prepare themselves for normal times and try to address those issues. And I'll remember a few years ago when Joseph Stiglitz, which you may know, is a Nobel Prize winner, but it was also many years ago he was a vice president of research at the World Bank. And whenever there was a crisis like the tequila crisis or the Asian crisis or the financial crisis, if you read the newspaper, they would read something like once in a century crisis. So he said, it seems that once in a century crisis happens every 10 years. So we need to start prepared with an environment in which crises are inherent to what we do. So let me just think. In 2019, there was a trade conflict between the US and China, and most estimates assume that the world lost around $750 billion in terms of that conflict. 1 year later, there was, and that's around the size of the Swiss economy. 1 year later, that we all got hit by COVID, and the response, which was to try to isolate citizens, had a huge impact in the economy. In my own country, the GDP reduced by 8.25%. That was the worst recession or the worst recession since the Great Depression. I think in Sri Lanka was a little bit of 7%, slightly better than Mexico, very, very bad. But then after COVID, you got a rising inflation and that. Then we have the Russian invasion on Ukraine, which increased the price of corn, grains, and oil. And then you have rising inflation and coup d'etats in Nigeria, in Gabon, in Burkina Faso. So we are living in an environment which is much more prone to crisis. So the institutions and the governments need to prepare not only to manage properly in normal times, but need to create the appropriate buffers for a world which is becoming very uncertain. So advanced economy has the luxury of just dealing with it anytime that this crisis comes. Developing countries like ours need to actually build buffers before. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Herrera, for that wonderful introduction and comprehensive outlook into governance. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now be moving into the highlight of our evening, so please join me in welcoming Murtaza Jafferjee, Chairman of the Advocata Institute, and Arturo Herrera Gutiérrez as they engage in conversation on governance and reform. Please note that as the discussion goes on, a QR code will be displayed on the screen. Please feel free to send in any questions that you have regarding Mr. Herrera's presentation, as well as the conversation that might come up. Over to you, Mr. Murtaza.
Thank you. Just outside your hotel, we had a protest movement in Sri Lanka 2 years ago called the Aragalaya. It's called the struggle. And the young people who were at the forefront said, we want system change. But unfortunately, nobody defined what that change was. So we are in the midst of a presidential election, which will come up somewhere in October of this year. And there's a lot of confusion of the right kind of changes that need to be done. Because there's nothing fundamentally wrong with our Sri Lankan genes. Our people do quite okay when they go overseas. Some of them really excel. Something is not working within our system that is leading to these crises. Advocata wanted to create a number of discussions basically with regard to this system change and what exactly we need to do. I don't know whether you are aware that Sri Lanka was the first country in Asia that requested the IMF to do a IMF governance diagnostic on the country. And they have issued a report, a 130-page report, which tackles some of these issues. So we are having a forum on the 18th of May to discuss this. And hopefully towards the end of June, entire session on discussion of how to grow, especially through productivity. So your visit to Sri Lanka was very timely, and that is why we organized today's event. You touched on many interesting topics that I would like to explore, and then we will also leave time for the audience to ask questions. So if I may start off with, so that the audience can connect a little bit better with you, how did you get involved in politics?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if I ever got involved in politics. So I have clear, I would say, ideology, right? So I'm not sure how familiar you are with these issues, but Latin America is one of the regions with the worst in income inequality. So I grew up in a state which was mostly rural, and it was the fourth poorest state in the country.
So is that on the southern side?
In the central side, right? So it was actually the three wars were Chiapas, Guerrero, Oaxaca in the southern side, and then my state, right? So for me, it was almost obvious, as an obvious part of life when I was a kid, to see that there was something wrong and there was something that needed to be addressed. And when I was a teenager, at some point, I thought, okay, so how could I contribute to try to help this? And what should I study to try to help? And that's when I decided to study economics. Now, I took a very specific decision when I started building my career, and was to one decision that I took. It was, despite that I have my very own personal political preferences, I decided explicitly not to register myself in a political party. And that gave me a little bit of leeway to try to build programs when I was in government with a technocratic view. Right? Now, what is behind these kind of issues that I mentioned is not only very dry numbers. What is behind it, if you have a government which has running a budget in a responsible way, it gives the government the possibility to address issues like like fighting poverty, like providing electricity, like providing water in a proper way and build it through time, right? So very often what we tend to do, and I probably did it today, was to focus on the technocratic aspects, but what is behind is the possibility to serve to the citizens. And that was what motivated me when I got into public sector.
Okay. If I was to take a side question, in the about 5 years ago, we had an economic assistance program by the Soros Foundation, by the Center for International Development at the Kennedy School, led by Ricardo Hausman. As you know, Hausman, Valesco, and Roddick have the growth diagnostic framework, uh, which is a little bit diametrically opposite to the Washington consensus. Some of the things that you spoke about was about really building the institutions, but they argue that developing countries don't have the wherewithal to do everything, so to focus on what they call the binding constraints. What's your thoughts on that?
So first of all, I have to say Andres Velasco was my professor
Okay.
in NYU, so I feel very close. I feel very close to him. What I think we need to do, and this is something in which we really focus, is to recognize that the developing world is very heterogeneous. So you may have some kind of reforms that work in Brazil and Poland and Romania, but those are different kind of reforms that are going to work in Haiti or in Bolivia or in Jordan. And those indeed are different than the kind of reforms that are going to work in Burkina Faso or in Burundi, right? So what we need to do is to tailor the reforms to the capacity and the institutional capacity that has a country, and then understand that some of these things are going to take time, right? So there are some reforms that actually help countries to turn around in a relatively short time. So I know you are under an IMF program, and I know that there's already talks that there may come another IMF program. And my country went, when I was a student, under an IMF program. We have a huge debt crisis in 1995. We need to receive assistance from the IMF.
This is the tequila crisis.
Yeah. Actually, it was not sufficient, the IMF. So the US should actually have to come with money. The World Bank, everybody, right? It was a very deep crisis. But we start fixing the house. And five years later, by the year 2000, we actually paid back the last dollar to the IMF. And we haven't had a program since then, right? So there's a way out. And it took us 5 years. And we have keep building through that. In 1995, in the private sector, we won't be able to get a loan for more than a week, right? Now, Mexico could issue bonds for 50 years, for 100 years. We have issued those kind of bonds. And it means that the markets believe that the public sector in Mexico is sustainable for many decades, coming. Most of the debt that Mexico raises is from the private sector. But it's also interesting to me because people always think about the bank of the World Bank or the IMF and think that these are institutions which have big pockets. First of all, they are not that big. But when you raise the money from the private sector and you sell a bond and somebody is buying it, very often it's a pension fund. It's behind have teachers, nurses, doctors, which are saving their money in their own country for the long term. So it's a double commitment, not only for your country, but also to fulfill a promise to repay for someone in which saving for when they became became elderly.
So, Arturo, in preparation for our discussion today, I did read the Article 4 report of the IMF on Mexico, and they are commending you for your debt at 55% of GDP, although you have a little bit of high real interest rates. But interestingly, there was a chart there that the banks own very little of your debt. In Sri
What's our
Lanka,
chart?
the banks own very little of your debt,
Correct.
Mexico's debt. In Sri Lanka, the banks own a lot of the debt. How is that possible? If the banks don't own your debt, who's owning your debt?
It's the bond market, right?
Right.
So if you go back to 1990, if you go back to 1982, when my graphics started, the debt of Mexico was actually owned by private banks, commercial banks, and foreign banks, right? So that means that the debt was, first of all, in dollars, right? And that's okay, and the interest rate was variable, and that's okay as long as there's no devaluation and the interest rate don't go up. And that's exactly what happened in 1982. We learned a little bit, and by 1995, our debt was a little bit with the commercial banks, some in bonds, but it was mostly in dollars again. 80% of the debt was in dollars, and then there was a huge devaluation. And if you have a devaluation of 100%, suddenly from one day to another, your debt in your own currency increases by 100%. Right? So what we learned? We learned first that we have to have these sustainable paths. We cannot allow our debt grow. Then we have to have it in our own currency so that we would not be exposed to a foreign exchange risk. But that means, for example, that we needed to develop our pension funds so that the savings that were coming from our pension funds will be buying the debt issue from the government. But also we recognize that the institutional investors, the ones who buy the debt, that goes faster than the commercial banks. And it also has one clear advantage, which is they have a secondary market. When a commercial bank lends you, I mean, there's some agreements in terms of the interest, and they keep there. When you borrow from the bond market and you do something wrong, you still get punished in the secondary market. But the opposite also happens. If you start doing better, you start pricing better in the secondary market. So most of the debt that Mexico now raises is in the bond market. But that's a market that we start building in 1995. So if you think about it, it has taken 29 years. Mm-hmm. So you have to have consistent policies and consistent policies on the debt side, and it takes time to do it.
So you mentioned about the pension funds. I'm familiar and have interacted with the godfather of the Chilean system. Do you have a similar contributory system in Mexico?
Yeah, it's a defined contributions system.
So the government does not fund the pension system.
Well, we still are in a transition period, right? Because you may imagine someone which came to the job market in 1985, the pension system changed in 1997. So the person who came into the job market in 1985 is still paid through the defined payment, defined contribution, as opposed to the other system.
Okay. Now you said an interesting thing that 95 you had a crisis, the tequila crisis, but Mexico was very well known for the Latin American debt crisis. You said you put your house in order after 95. Why didn't you fix it after the 1980s?
I don't think we perfectly understood what was the problem, and I don't think we had these institutionally arrangements. It may sound really obvious now, but they are not. Having this way of weights and counterbalances and the proper setup, let's say, of a debt office, right? Which is raising the funds, which is writing, which is following. So I remember a few years ago, I was told a story about someone which became really important later. He was actually the Secretary General of the OECD until 3 years ago. But when he was relatively young, he was managing the debt office in Mexico. And they told me that in one of the negotiations, he would come and sit, and he will have the liability spreadsheet of the country in his head. So he would say, we owe this to this country and to this bank, and this is to this bank, this bank. That's perfect. That means that he's brilliant. But that's not the way you manage that. You have to have proper systems, models, running scenarios, etc. So it took some time for us to get to that level. It also meant that we had to build in the human resources and in the capacity building. For a long time, we were relying in the central bank. The central bank was an advisor on trying to prepare the economists and the financial management staff. And for a long time, actually, the Ministry of Finance was providing scholarships for some of their staff to go and be trained. We were not ready, and we didn't understand exactly what was happening.
You mentioned about how it was all on a...
And if I may, there was one specific thing that we didn't understand. We didn't understand the role of expectations. We didn't understand that if the markets don't believe you in the long run, they are not buying your debt now. And it was important to have credibility, not today, but to have credibility for the future.
Arturo, it said that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And when you said about one individual at the spreadsheet, although I was never in government in Sri Lanka, I think something like that was happening. A super individual who thought they can manage all the cash flows of the economy. We are also trying to set up a centralized debt office because we yet have a lot of debt. And I believe that it is a conditionality or a structural benchmark of the IMF program. You have any advice for us, or what are the things that we should think about in setting it up? The governance, the capacity building, the institutions, how we should engage with the markets?
Yeah. So a typical debt office has three areas, right? First of all, it has a huge interaction with the chief economist, as you will see. The chief economist is going to tell what is the amount of debt that it's going to be.
So in your system, chief economist is the Ministry of Finance.
Yeah, and they report that to the same vice minister. There's a deputy finance minister, which has several responsibilities, has two huge. It manages the debt office, and it manages the chief economist, but they sit separately, right? Then the debt office, it has several responsibilities. One is the relationship with investors. So because these bonds could be bought by investors in Asia, it could be bought by investors in Europe, it could be bought by investors here. In the case of Mexico, investors from the US actually buy also peso-denominated bonds. So even in your own currency, you may have nationals buying, and that office...
But you also have forex-denominated debt.
Yeah, around 20% of the debt. So 80% of the debt is in peso, and then 20% is divided in mostly dollars, then euros, and then yens, right? So this is the big market. And that the front office of that debt department needs to be able to engage with these potential bondholders and explain it, what are the perspectives, right? It's also, as you may imagine, they need to be able to express in English, to be able to reach what triggers an investor in Japan, which is different than what triggers an investor in California or in New York. Then they have to be able to properly manage that, organize it, like having the proper spreadsheets and not on someone's head. And then there's another area which is in charge of actually making sure that the payments happen, that there are arrangements. These contracts could be signed in the country, but it could be signed under a law in New York or in Luxembourg or in Europe. So there's an administrative charge that it has to be organized very well. You need these people which are financiers, you need these people which are lawyers, but also you need which are economists, but also you need lawyers, people who understand how the contracts are signed. So it becomes a very sophisticated management.
And your instruments, are they traded on your stock market, or how is the secondary market?
Yeah, they are traded in our own stock market, and they are traded in different stock markets.
But you don't have a separate market for government securities. It is in the same market, is it?
It is in the same market.
Same market. And one of the questions that I had, it was more general to institutions, but say like a debt office, you need a lot of very market savvy guys, right? You want the best and the brightest in your country to side with the government. So how do you pay for them? These investment bankers get a lot of money
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
private market. I mean, governments can't be paying them at the same. So how do you get the best talent in?
So, so you first of all you need to know how to recruit them, how to groom them, and also assume that at some point they may decide to leave, right? So usually there are two institutions that are very attractive for a young economist, let's say, out of college or out of master's degree to work. One is the Ministry of Finance, the other one is the central bank, right? They have the same problem in terms of greeting. There's a sense of pride, right, of working for these institutions. A young economist learn a lot, right? There's also needs to be a little bit of an interest to serve your nation, right? But we have seen people who, I'm not gonna, so I have seen someone which started working on debt management, young in his career, moved to the money desk of Pemex, right? Because a state-owned enterprise could have also very sophisticated liability management, moved back to the Ministry of Finance, was the head of the debt department, then actually became the deputy finance minister. Now, that position is very close to be political, so you cannot expect to remain there forever. So at some point, he left that position after, I don't know, 20 years career, and he went to New York. He worked for one of the largest, if not the largest, money fund manager in New York, right? But it's okay. He worked for 20 years for the country. That may happen. What you don't like is what start losing that on the first year, on the second year, or on the third year, right? Because at the end of the day, they will be better compensated.
So now in Sri Lanka, for administrative service, there is a specific salary structures, but you can apply that to these kind of people. So do you have a differential remuneration structure? Or are they like paid similar to the Ministry of Finance? Or
So people at the central bank tend to be paid a little bit better.
yeah, they do.
In Mexico, I don't know here, but in Mexico they tend to be
Here
paid.
too.
And actually in the US also happen. People at the Fed are better paid than people. Then people at the Ministry of Finance are better paid than the people at the Ministry of Agriculture, right? But there's a limit on that, right? So when I went from working at the World Bank to be deputy finance minister, which is one of the most distinguished positions that you may have, I actually took a very big haircut on my pay, right? So, yeah.
Okay. This is a more generic question. History and the political system of a country can significantly influence its institutions. Why don't you kind of illustrate this by your country's history? My understanding was there was elite capture, the history of Mexico. You had an emperor, and there was a elite class who controlled the country, and I believe there was one party who was in power for many years
Until 2000.
Can you illustrate the answer to my question about how history and the political system influence the type of institutions that a country can have?
No, it's critical, right? And it was only when I moved to the World Bank and I started looking a broader view that I started understanding the specifics about my country, right? So my country is a federal country. Where I thought, okay, all countries are federal, right? So we actually used to refer to the government or the federal government, right? We assume. Then when you look to Latin America, only Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina are actually federal countries. Most of the rest of the countries are unitary countries, right? So there are several historical patterns that are very relevant for a country. One relevant is who was a country who colonized you, right? So we were colonized by Spain. So we have an administrative tradition, Germanic Bourbonic. So you were colonized by the British. So you have a Westminster tradition. So that's why you have a parliament, which is much more stronger than our Congress in Mexico. Then to that, historically countries were choosing the kind of system that they wanted when they become independent, either federal or unitary. So Mexico took a decision to be federal in the 19th century, and that sets you on a specific path. And one different tradition is also if a country that have to side finance and planning together or separate. We have finance and planning together, which I think is the case in Sri Lanka, and that two different types of conditions.
So you have a president, right? You have the executive is the president, and the Congress is like a parliament. Right?
Yeah.
So you said about how to do budgeting correctly. I believe that in Sri Lanka we do the appropriations first. We get parliament to approve spending, and then figure out how we are going to pay for that. But what you are advocating is the reverse, basically, that first decide how much of revenue that you can collect, and then decide how much of debt service payments you have, and then decide how much you have to spend. We have been doing it diametrically opposite. I'm presuming that if you do it the way we do it, you never get it right.
Yeah. I mean, because the budget is not only a technical process; it's also a political process. And it's okay that there's a political process. People in Congress were voted by people to represent their interests, right? And someone with good faith could say, I want 10 schools for my district and water. And I also want it for my own state, right? But on a given year, you could just afford something, right? And this pressure, which is very clear in our country, is about providing to our citizens with the need to do it with matching the budget. That's the tricky part. And that's why it has to be some sort of institutional setup that allow Congress to distribute and allocate, but within what the country has. Otherwise, it's possible to do it for 1 year. And you may do it for 2 years. You are running debt, but at some point it catches up with you. That's what happened in the 80s, right? So I didn't go into the specifics, but what triggered the debt crisis in Mexico in 82 is what we discovered oil in the 70s, right? We actually thought, the president thought that our problem was to learn to manage our wealth, right? So we were going to become so rich that we were not prepared to be rich. And how do we start taking oil out of the ground? Well, we borrow money, we borrow it in dollars, and we thought it was fine. It was not that naive because the price of oil is in dollars and our borrowing is in dollars, and everything will be fine as long as the price of oil didn't go down and the price of oil went down. So that's why, and it took many years to correct it. So it's not worth to give more 1 year because the country is run much longer. You have to do it to be good for many years.
So Arturo, I noted on your slide that you also have a budget office, right? You have a budget office that kind of cost certain electoral promises or any program that the legislature plans to do, how much it's going to cost. That is located within Parliament, or how is it structured?
No. That's at the Ministry of Finance.
But you don't have an independent like the American budget office.
Yeah. We have it in Congress.
You have it in Congress also.
So, right. So it's a Center for Financial Studies, right? So usually it reports directly to the Finance Commission in Congress, and it's doing forecasts. It also makes estimates of how much it want to cost a reform of a program if someone in the Congress wants to have it, right? And it brings a little bit of discipline to the process in terms of making sure that within the Congress they have a body that could advise them on what is feasible and what is not feasible. And an ideal model is a model of the CBO in the US, when although it reports to a political body like the Congress, you cannot think that the Congress is not political. It's perceived as being independent, political neutral, and trying to provide the best estimates possible based on technical grounds and not on political grounds.
Okay. I will shortly open the floor to questions, and I do have some reserved questions. But you mentioned about importance of institutions and the competition regulation. Uh, I have never visited your country, but I have read about elite capture and Carlos Slim, the richest man in Mexico, controlled the telecom monopoly. You want to comment about whilst you were in government, or even I believe Luis Videgras,
They are
they
right.
Vigara, he tried to reform the system where they were trying to bring in more competition, etc. Did it get a lot of traction?
He got a little bit. And actually, it's a very interesting example of what you mentioned, because Luis passed a series of reforms, right? And some of those reforms, they are relevant by themselves. So if you change the regulatory framework for some sector properly, then it's about getting the proper investment. But some reforms actually use the first step. They actually need to be implemented, and that's where very often developing countries miss the point. It's not sufficient to pass a law. You actually have to have the proper department, the proper institutionally, and the proper capacity to implement those kind of laws.
Does your country have an issue with election financing and the corruption that goes with it?
Sure, but there's a way in which we try to address it, right? So the way we try to address it is there's public financing for the parties.
Okay.
Right? So giving money privately is just, you could do it in a very minuscule way. So that is a way to try to avoid that groups of interest actually finance the elections. But something that we learned is, you mentioned that that my country was actually dominated by one party until 2000. So when the democracy started to fall in Mexico, it was really, really important. Not only there was competition between parties, but there was also competitions within the parties. So there were primary elections, etc. And I would say we are really happy about that, right? But what we didn't understand is that competition required money for running campaigns, not only against other parties, but also for primaries. And that has opened doors for corruption.
Yeah. So we are very familiar because our electoral system is quite large here. So you had to quite literally compete within your own party to get on these preferences. And I think it's a bad system design. So interestingly, your government funds the political parties. But how do you define who gets how much?
It's proportional to the number of votes that they got in the previous election.
So then it is favoring the incumbent, right?
Yeah, but the PRI was bought out in 2000 by PAM. PAM was bought out in 2012 by the PRI, and the PRI was bought out in 2018. So the incumbent has not stayed for a long time, okay, despite the fact that they have more money.
And I believe your next election is two ladies, right, who are running against each other.
The next election is in 4 weeks.
4 weeks, and two women are competing, right?
Yeah. So for and a guy, but the two women are the top candidates. So the first time in history, a president of Mexico will most likely be a female.
Okay. We have time for questions. There is a Slido platform, but I don't have the Slido app. I've forgotten to log in. Is there anybody in the audience who'd like to ask a question, or Akila, if there is anything that is coming on the system? Yes, Governor.
Thank you very much. One interesting thing that you show in the institutional framework of fiscal policy, where three ministers, vice minister, revenue, three, and then technocrats on the side, secretary, finance minister, chief economist, that office. So are they elected ministers? Are they elected representatives, or are they nominated or technocrats? I mean, this will follow up another question once you answer it.
Yeah, it's actually, as he actually pointed out, countries define the way they work based in historical traditions. So Mexico does not follow a Westminster tradition, which when typically ministers tend to be first members of parliament and that. So these are, in principle, technocrats fully appointed by the president. Now, there are some specific cases in which and just some specific cases in which for some positions they need to be ratified by Congress.
Do you have a Senate also?
Yeah. So people who go to be members of the board of governors of the central bank need to be ratified by the Senate. Deputy finance minister and minister need to be ratified by the lower house. But actually, the debt management director need to be ratified by the lower house. So this idea that we were discussing a few minutes ago, that is really important to have a proper department of debt management and proper people there, is so ingrained in the institution that actually that appointed has to be ratified by Congress.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's why usually this, when you call minister, usually what we refer as a elected by people, does not necessarily mean has a technical competency to hold that position.
Yeah,
So
no.
that's just my question was that how do you sort out that? Second one, after these people are holding for a fixed term, or therefore government changes, this ministers would be changed again by the new government, right?
Yeah, they could be removed by the new government, but also they could be removed within the own government. If you think about the crisis that we have in the 80s and 90s, people were moving quite frequently.
So then can the different administration come and change? So how strong the institution, I think this is an important point that you raise. If those chief economists, budget office, how strong the institution so that different administration come in, different ministers, how stable the system and how new administration can change the early administration policies.
So most likely you build a de facto civil service tradition. The way I have observed it in many countries is you tend to have a very professionalized civil service tradition in the central bank and in the foreign affairs ministry. And then at the Ministry of Finance, out of need, you get a de facto system. So the example I gave you about this former vice minister who then moved to a big financial firm in New York, he actually started probably pretty low and start moving up. So it's some sort of an implicit recognizing that it's important to keep the technical staff and letting them grow. Now, vice minister positions, minister positions, and sometimes even general directors are removed. And that's okay as long as you have a sufficient large pool of senior managers which have the right capabilities.
Asha, you have any questions? No. Late. Anybody else?
What are your thoughts on green debt, like the downsides and the upside compared
Green
to
debt, environmental
debt.
debt,
Yeah.
green debt.
compared to traditional debts?
Yeah. So actually, when I was Minister of Finance, we issued a first sustainable bond for Mexico, and now after I left, it was euro denominated, and now they have been using it. And so there are, I would say, three aspects that I would like to mention about it. First of all, if it's green or not green, it's still debt. You still have to pay it, right? So that doesn't mean that it's manna coming out from
Heaven.
it has to fit your debt sustainability path, right? Now, it signals one direction of a government, which is trying to take care of the environment and invest on the environment. Because one of the arrangements of a green bond is that the proceeds needs to go to environmental issues or to adaptation issues or to mitigation issues. And that in the budget, because you saw we start, right? In the budget means that you need to start making reallocations in the budget and start, rather than investing, I would say, in oil, you have to start investing in green energy. The second point is that it's a recognition that we have we are way delayed in terms of facing uh, uh, our climate change challenges, and we have to do it. But the third one is that in the old days, these bondholders that I was meaning were kind of anonymous, right? So there was a firm in New York or in LA or in Frankfurt, and they were just trying to get the best possible return and with the highest possible return with the lowest possible risk, right? Now what you see is that the people from which they are managing that money actually have a voice. So when I was in a roadshow raising money for Mexico, I remember a couple of meetings in Frankfurt and Munich, and the asset managers we were sitting for we were managing hundreds, if not thousands of millions of dollars, but it was on behalf of pension funds of the teachers. And the teachers had a view on the world they want to build.
A mandate.
They want to build a world which is more environmental friendly. And they told to the money managers, well, you cannot buy any kind of bond. You have to start investing in bonds which are going to take care of our world. So it's not, so first point is a green bond is still a bond. It may be green, but it's a bond. So you have to pay it. Second one, it has certain commitments in terms of allocations. And the third one is because of these pressures from the ultimate principles of that, the world is starting to move in that direction. So you better start to accommodate.
Is it cheaper?
Well, that's a question that everybody asks, right? First, it's segmented. Mm-hmm. So there are some markets which only invest on this one. And very often they could be cheaper, mm-hmm. right? But they also could be oversubscribed because a country, and Sri Lanka went over this situation a few years ago. I don't know about the specifics today, or I don't want to comment about the specifics today. Sometimes countries, it's not a matter of pricing, it's a matter of liquidity. Do you have access to a market or not? And this gives you a completely different door in a different market.
There was somebody, yes, Harsha. Wait. He's, Harsha, you have met.
I just arrived 2 days ago, but I have met many people
most
here.
Of the people,
yeah.
Right.
You said after 95, after 2000 you paid back IMF and you never went there again. And similar story with India in 1991. You also wore a political hat at one point. How did you convince the people of Mexico? Right? How did the government convince the people of Mexico that these reforms were absolutely essential for Mexico to really get out of crisis and sort of get back on a sustainable, inclusive growth path?
Actually, I think we did a pretty poor job on that, right? We were not able to translate the technocratic discourse in terms that the people could actually understood it. So we were over-indebted. So we have to correct our revenue side. And one of the main correction was actually to increase the rate on the value-added taxes, right? I still remember the photograph of the Congress voting to increase the value-added tax, which was an extremely brave decision and very responsible. The president of the Congress in 1995 still have a name on people's mind. So I think one thing that is different from those days to now is that we need to bring a discourse which is in terms that everybody can understand it, but also in terms of the trade-offs, right? Because we could look to different models of countries, right? If we look to France and Denmark, education is free and of high quality from kindergarten to doctorate, right? And health is free from kindergarten and doctorate. And health is free, right? But that has a cost. They collect 43% of GDP in taxes. Now you could have you could imagine a country which is equally successful with a different model, the UK and the US, right? The US decided to have a much lower taxation than Denmark, but the education costs a lot if you want to go to a good university, and you better have insurance if you.
Healthcare.
So this reflects, no contract is better than the other one, but this reflects the social contract of a country. What does a country want to do? And I think if you ask these people in Denmark, they would say, I want to be taxed high, but I want these services. If you ask too many people in the US, they say, no, I don't want to be taxed high. They actually have a sort of anti-government features, but then it's much more costly. But this trade-off needs to be made public when you face a nation. You say, we could aspire to have that, but it will require everybody to do their part, or not. But then we will be growing at these rates. Education will be a different quality between private and public sector. There will be less mobility, and that needs to be made transparent. And this is something that we just recently are understanding. Even central banks have changed the way in which they communicate. I remember when Alan Greenspan was chairman of the Fed, and he came to testify before the Congress, and he was explaining something, and then a member of the Senate started answering and say, Mr. Chairman, if I understood you correctly, and he was interrupted by Greenspan, said, if you understood me correctly, I may have misspelled, because the point was that you didn't understood me, right? He was trying. But then you move a few years later with Bernanke, and Bernanke said, no, we're going to make it transparent, all these things. And actually, not only I'm going to tell you what I want to achieve today, but I'm going to tell you what I'm trying to achieve in the future, and that's what forward guidance is. So there has been a shift in which policy is being done from something that was kept very close to the chest of the technocrats to recognizing that needs to be transparent with the citizens or with the markets.
We would like to know what were the reforms that were executed in Mexico. I think one was increase of taxes, that any other things that we can take for. And the other thing, did the reforms or anything cut down on the expenses of the government? Because what happens in Sri Lanka is they increase their salaries, their perks. Even I think in Netherlands, Switzerland, the prime minister or the president rides a bike. But here, our people go on BMWs, Benzes with entourage, with a capacity of vehicles. Their petrol consumption might be very high.
So
I think
we got the
things-
question. He's asking on the expenditure
yeah.
side.
And the institutions.
Yeah, what are the other kind of reforms?
Reforms,
So,
yes.
so the other reform was an antitrust commission, independent commission.
Antitrust.
The other reform was a pension reform.
Right.
The establishment of a telecommunications commission to adjudicate competition issues, but also when the country was auctioning a spectrum for TV or for radio to do it on the independence of the central bank was very important. Independence of the electoral commission, right? And then, yeah, when we were living on all these crises, actually it was about reducing the salaries, right? And yes, government officials tend to think very high of themselves, right? And I have been on that seat. So before I became minister, it was a tradition that they have a security detail and a military detail, right? So they took out the military detail from me, and I felt okay. And now that was after I live in Washington, and in Washington I was riding a bike, right? So I took my bike to Mexico, and I tried to ride my bike, and the people from my security detail, they were opposing it, right? But it's not only that. With the traffic in Mexico City, sometimes you go faster in your bike, and that's where I get a little bit of my exercise, right? So So at some point I say, okay, I have a second bike. If you want to come with me, you come with me, but you have to ride a bike. And I'll finish this story with something very interesting. One time I was about to cross the main road in Mexico City, which is Insurgentes is called. And I was in my bike with my helmet, so I had to wear a helmet, right? And there was someone from my security detail in a bike, right? And we were stopped in a traffic light. It was probably 7 p.m., so it's kind of dark. So it was not easy for people to realize that I was a minister. And a lady started looking at me from a car, right? And she started kind of realizing. So eventually I crossed the path, and she lowered her window and said, so what happened to the grocery? How something happened to you, right? Like, take care, don't be riding your bike.
I think there was 1 second, we have to get going. I had a few reserved questions, Arturo. I also, with regard to these questions about reform, I have happened to have sat with Luis de Gare previously, and I learned from him that you have enormous number of trade treaties, right? Free trade, and Mexico espouses free trade. You don't have a lot of tariff protection. Like most countries, you have free trade agreements with. Was it always the case historically?
No, historically, if basically you look to every country and go back to the 19th century, the main source of revenue and taxation for a country were taxes on trade, taxes on import, and sometimes taxes on exports. And to move to a free trade model, you actually have to reduce those taxes. But that also means that not only that you are doing something on the trade policy, but actually you have to do something on the revenue policy, because you have to substitute the sources of income that are not coming from them. But also you need to understand that it's not about just signing a treaty, right? You have to adhere to certain competitive laws. You cannot subsidize goods because that's dumping. You have to understand that you require more efficient customs because goods are going to be coming and going at a faster.
Was there resistance from within when you had to do trade reform?
Yeah, huge.
So the vested interests, I mean, the local industrialists would have opposed, right?
Sure, but also the parties.
Political parties.
Yeah, but you have seen now parties moving from all the spectrum, and no party has advocated to.
So the political discourse is not about protectionism.
It may have been at a time,
but your
it's
neighbor
not anymore.
is talking about
It's
that.
not anymore.
Your neighbor in America is talking about more and more protection.
Yeah. I mean that's surprising. Not only that he was in the U.S., but also that he was coming from the Republican Party. Because if you may have think that one party may have been a little bit more protectionist, it would have been the Democrats and not the Republicans.
So I just have two quick questions. Sri Lanka has misallocated a lot of capital in infrastructure. And the IMF had a report called Well Spent, how strong infrastructure governance can end waste in public investment. And I believe the IMF did a report on Mexico during 2019. Were you in power then?
Yeah, I was.
You were. Probably helped read that report. And I do understand there was a big furor about this big airport that was going to be built in Mexico City, and that was cancelled, and the existing government is building this Maya train. Can you illustrate exactly what the IMF said and how you managed that part?
Yeah. Okay, so it's very interesting because first of all, you have to remind that we paid the last dollar to the IMF in 2000. So we have a different relationship that Sri Lanka with the IMF.
Okay.
We don't need to listen to them. So they actually have a hard time getting an appointment. So I remember once I was in Congress and they told me, those policies that the Washington Consensus Institution are trying to impose, I told them, they don't. We don't owe to the IMF, we don't owe to the World Bank. As I say, we owe to the bondholders, right? So we don't actually entertain that conversation with them. Nevertheless, the issue was very important. First of all, I think that the problem with infrastructure in Mexico is not about that airport or not. The problem with infrastructure in Mexico is that we have a very low public investment as percentage of GDP. We have one of the lowest in Latin America. And we have been taking care of the fiscal, but now means that if we have to increase the public investment, we have to increase tax collection. Right?
And you get about 3% of GDP from oil, right?
Around 4% of GDP from oil. But we only invest 3% of GDP in public investment, and countries may be in 6-7% of GDP. Overall investment is around 21% of GDP, so it means that the rest is invested by the private sector. So we better be in good terms with the private sector because they invest 7 times more than the public sector.
So with regard to the infrastructure, so the Mexican government doesn't take the lead in public infrastructure. So do you do it through public-private partnerships, or how is it done?
So there's a mix, right? So there's a mix of joint ventures in Pemex. There's a mix of PPPs. Some of the PPPs proved to be not well designed, and actually they stain a little bit that. Also, you may know it touches Mexico very little, but the biggest scandals on corruption 10 years ago in Latin America were related to infrastructure, to other. It was in Brazil, it was in Dominican Republic, it was in Peru, it was in Argentina, it was even in Angola. And some of them were related to PPPs, right? So the mechanisms, I think, is very important, but it got a little bit stained in Latin America.
And my final question to you, we will have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, is do you think think tanks have a role in improving governance in a country and influencing policy?
They do, but they have to be very clear about who's their audience. Because if they got very sophisticated, their audience may be very influential, but it's a small part of the population. They should make an effort also to translate that sophisticated dialogue in terms that everybody in the country could understand it.
And that's where we come from. I mean, the advocata comes from the word advocate. So ours is about public communication, especially in the vernacular. Yeah. We have time for a couple more questions. Yes, Mahanta. And then, yes.
Very quick question from you, sir. Is what's your view or take on the reforms that Sri Lanka is doing in terms of getting out of our debt restructuring and our we are a bankrupt country right now. Still, we haven't paid our international debt as such yet. What's your view in terms of the World Bank and your personal view?
And we'll take. He was a former head of our tax office. The gentleman, can you give me? Okay.
Thanks. One of your slides indicated that about an integrated effort for fight against corruption. Can you explain further on that? Because as we understand, a country can't develop the framework only within maybe revenue authorities or maybe some other connected parts, but in a country, overall effort should be there. So can you just explain about that for...
He's asking
yes.
about the corruption
Understanding.
framework for the whole country.
No.
As a whole.
One last question. This is the last question.
My question is regard to those institutions. This is regard to aspirations, enactment, and the follow-up action. How does it work in Mexico? Because in Sri Lanka, you see a lot of delays in we aspire, we enact very late, 5-6 years, maybe 10 years late. Then even the follow-up action, especially regard revenue generation, customs, inland revenue, there's very little action on collecting
implementation.
Yes. How does it
His
work?
question was about the reform and your views on Sri Lanka. That's about the anti-corruption framework.
Yeah.
And he's about implementation.
So this actually related to this one, and you just have to keep in mind that I arrived to Sri Lanka on Tuesday. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very deep knowledge answer about it. No, but I think the series of reforms that have been proposed or on the table either by the government or with the IMF, they go in the right direction. But the question is how that you're going to implement it, which brings me to this issue. And it's not sufficient. I'll give you an example that we have been discussing in many countries. For corruption issues, one of the things that you need to have is a beneficial ownership registry, right? And many countries are establishing a beneficial ownership registry. But that's not sufficient. You just create an office by a decree. You actually know how that office should work, right? So in my view, part of the challenge will be on how to actually implement those reforms. And that's probably where institutions like the World Bank, we should be focusing. It's not only that the right reforms need to be there, we need to make sure that we help you, if you require our help, to implement it properly. And now that brings me back to your question. Government, the traditions in governments is to operate in silos, right? So the tax administration unit operates and try to be careful with certain kind of corruption, the one who allows to evade taxes. But then the procurement agency tries to operate with a different kind of corruption, that's bribing to get a contract. And then the anti-money laundering agency deals with a different kind of issues. But all that information that is generated in each of these agencies is government operation and need to be shared and to have a holistic view in a responsible way, because you don't want also the tax information be dangling around. So there has to be systems that tell how to share it. There has to be systems, for example, in Mexico, the tax administration system, which allow to check if you have paid your taxes, right? And somebody comes and checks in the system, that's fine, that's required. But it leaves the name of who access your information. Mm-hmm. So if your information is leaked, they know who's responsible. So it's not only about working on that, but it requires a set of institutional firewalls to make sure that it's going to be done in a responsible way. And we have been working in I'm not going to talk about it, but in very successful examples to identify corruption patterns using all the information that the government has. The three that I mentioned, but also public registry, commercial registry, to know when a firm that is bidding for a contract of $100 million, if that firm was founded a month ago, there's something suspicious, right? By definition, they have no experience.
So, although we are out of time, I just wanted to put in a last question. When many of these questions that have been asked in your presentation, the game changer now is digital. All these things can be linked, etc. And it's a lot easier to act, to find out wrongdoings and also to act as a deterrent and remove the human element. Can you comment a little bit about your country and your finance ministry's maturity in terms of its IT system? Whether you had a lot of up-to-date information, do you have like an enterprise system? Do you have a lot of information to make decisions? Was it evidence-based?
Yeah, I mean, the gold standard is probably Korea, right?
Korea,
yeah.
Gold standard.
Yeah, so they have the best IFMI system to manage budget. They have the best system to manage procurement, the best digital system, right? They probably are a little bit too good because now they start relying on the system. The system is a tool, right? It doesn't substitute. So the right mix is to develop a digital system, but be clear about what you want to do. Don't develop a digital system just for the sake of it. The second point is that governments and citizens and researchers have a wealth of information that was not available many years ago. So when people do analysis of now taxpayers' behaviors, they have literally millions of observations, right? So you could do econometric analysis, which are much more robust than what we were doing now. But that requires actually to understand that data is important and understanding data is relevant. So that brings, so for example, going back to tax administrations 40 years ago used to be basically filed by accountants and lawyers, right? So now you tend to have departments which have econometricians, mathematicians, data scientists. So this kind of shifting is necessary.
Thank you very much. I just want to leave you with a factoid. I don't know whether you had the opportunity to taste a lot of Sri Lankan food. It's quite spicy, a lot of chilies. But chilies are not endemic to Sri Lanka. It's not indigenous to Sri Lanka. I think the Portuguese bought it from your country.
Yeah.
And it's part and parcel of our cuisine now. But I don't know whether you're aware that Sri Lanka is very famous for cinnamon. And most of our cinnamon goes to your country.
Yeah.
What do you do with it?
Well, I was telling Till today, right? So among other things, we put it in rice pudding.
Rice pudding?
Yeah, and I have it clear in my mind because my wife doesn't like it.
Okay.
She doesn't want her rice pudding with cinnamon. I like it. So we bought it from Sri Lanka.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Herrera and Mr. Jafferjee for that insightful discussion. I would now like to let you know that we have all come to the end of today's event. Thank you all for joining us today at our inaugural Fireside conversation on Institutions Matter, Driving Forces of Economic Growth. If the discussion here today has been interesting to you, I would like to invite you to join us at Advocata's upcoming forum, Charting the Course, Revitalizing Economic Governance for Prosperity, which will take place on the 18th of May, 2024 at the Golf Face Hotel in Colombo. We hope to see many of your faces there as well. As always, your feedback and thoughts on both the discussion and the event are invaluable to us. You can share these thoughts with us by scanning the QR code on the screen and responding to a very brief survey. Thank you once again for joining us this evening and for enriching the conversation here tonight. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and we look forward to your presence at our next Fireside conversation. Thank you.